Washington Journal continues.
Joining us on the program, Richard Viguerie, the chair of Conservative HQ, also the author of a book, Takeover, how the 100-year war for the soul of the GOP and how conservatives can finally win it. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Viguerie.
Always a pleasure to be back with you, Pedro.
Part of the reason we wanted to invite you on is some headlines that we've seen over the last few days, especially stemming out of the primaries. This was one of them from The Hill. It says T takes a hit in primary test. What do you think about those headlines?
Well, they're totally, completely false. Karl Rove in the Chamber of Commerce doesn't think the Tea Party is dead. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending tens of millions of dollars in the Republican primaries. In North Carolina, the Tea Party candidates spent a few $100,000. Karl Rove in the Chamber of Commerce came in literally with $2.5 million, got 46% of the vote, which is about what the Ted Cruz's candidate got in Texas in 2012, and if there had been a 50% requirement in a runoff, the Tea Party candidate probably would have won in North Carolina. So it's interesting, Pedro. The establishment candidates, the Karl Rove type candidates, are moving to the right. In fact, the entire Republican Party is moving to the right. We have gridlock in Congress, not because big government Republicans can't get along with big government Democrats. We have gridlock because of the Tea Party. And the grassroots conservatives are making their voice heard through things like C-SPAN now and the internet and talk radio. So the establishment knows that the Tea Party is alive and well, and they're very afraid of them, that they're going to stop the growth of government. In
this primary process, who are the establishment candidates and who are the Tea Party candidates that challenges, and what are your hopes of having those Tea Party candidates win?
Well, I think that two things. One, the Republican Party is becoming more conservative. John Boehner, we saw just this week, appoint a special counsel committee to investigate Benghazi. He's been resisting that for a year and a half, but finally there was so much conservative Tea Party type pressure on him that he could no longer resist. So you're seeing the Republican Party get more principled, get a backbone, get some spine. And if Tea Party candidates win, that's great. But if establishment candidates begin to act like Tea Party candidates, we're happy with that too. So, by the way, it's very, very difficult, we all know, to beat incumbents. Almost all, with few exceptions, of the Tea Party victories have come in open races. And there's open races in Georgia and Oklahoma and Iowa and Nebraska for Senate and governor. So I'm optimistic that Tea Party candidates are going to do very well this year.
You talk about the candidates themselves. Another headline, Tea Party power wanes. Mm-hmm. When you hear that word, what do you think?
Well,
I think they go back to the initial, fervor that took place in 2010, especially the influence of the party then.
What they're looking for, Pedro, is rallies in the streets. They don't see, hundreds of thousands of people, but the Tea Party people are smart. They've left the street now. Now they're in meetings, they're organizing, and they're planning, and they're training, and they're working for candidates and getting candidates elected. In Indiana, this past Tuesday, there were several big government type establishment House members, state legislative members that were beaten by Tea Party candidates. They're out there doing, the Tea Party and the principled conservatives, the hard work of working in the precincts and getting candidates elected. And by the way, most all of these headlines, with few exceptions, are written by the Tea Party's opponents. The mainstream media is promoting big government, and they like bigger government. They like more borrowing, more spending, more control in the federal government. And so these are the Tea Party's enemies that are writing the headlines. So just stay tuned and watch what happens, and you'll see the country move to the right.
You talked about the influence of the Tea Party with things like the Benghazi Select Committee. Is there evidence of work within the Congress of Tea Party members of making government smaller, such as what you would like to see?
Well, we don't have a majority yet. We certainly, Republicans don't have a majority, of course, in the Senate. And in the House, there's not a clear limited government constitutional conservative majority. We're working in that direction. In my opinion, in my book, Takeover, I outline a plan how conservatives in 2014, 2016 can take over the Republican Party and by 2017 be governing America. I paraphrase, Pedro, that well-known liberal, James Carville, a fellow Cajun. My heritage is Cajun as well as his. And in 1992, you remember, he ad nauseum to conservatives said over and over, it's the economy stupid, it's the economy stupid. So as conservatives, we say it's the primaries stupid, it's the primaries. So if conservatives stay focused on the primaries in 2014, 2016, I think that we can take over the Republican Party in 2016 and be governing America by 2017.
Within the government, or at least within the House itself, you have Speaker John Boehner. How would you describe his relationship with Tea Party members of Congress?
Well, it's difficult. It's difficult. Boehner, like so many politicians, came to Washington with the best of intentions. It's been said many times that so many politicians at the local level described Washington as, or maybe their state capital, as a cesspool. Send me to the state capital or to Washington and I'll clean up the cesspool. After a few years, they send a message back to the people at home, sorry, I made a mistake. It's not a cesspool, it's a hot tub. And they love the power and all the perks that go with it. And I've got what I call Viguerie's foolproof test of whether you're a conservative or not. And the foolproof test, whether you're talking about Bob Dole, John McCain, Mitt Romney, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell. Look around them. Who do they walk with? I never saw Ronald Reagan in the 1970s, and I saw him a lot, but I never saw him except I saw the friends of conservatives all around him. Well, when you saw Reagan, you say, there's Len Knopfsinger, and there's Ed Meese, and Dick Allen, and Judge Clark, and Paul Laxalt, Marty Anderson. So conservatives moved with him, so when he moved into the White House, conservatives did too. Not enough, but a lot did. But you look around John Boehner, I don't see any conservatives around him. I don't see any conservatives around Mitch McConnell or Romney or McCain or Bob Dole. So they may say they're conservatives, but they don't walk with conservatives.
Richard Viguerie, our guest, to talk about the Tea Party, its influence in 2014, even looking ahead to 2016. Not only has he written several columns on this, like he mentioned, a book of his called Takeover. We'll talk about some more of the details in those books in just a bit. But as we go on the morning, if you want to ask him questions, you can do so. 3 lines for you this morning. For Democrats, 202-585-3880. For Republicans, 202-585-3881. And for Independents, 202-585-3882. If you want to send your thought via tweet, you can do so at C-SPAN WJ, and you can send us an email too at journal@cspan.org. First call up is from Nicholas. Nicholas is from Illinois on a Republican line for Richard Viguerie. Good morning.
Hello. I'd like to ask what exactly defines a conservative today, because it seems like there's debates about whether or not conservatives should support an interventionist foreign policy, should conservatives support the death penalty, should conservatives support the drug war, things of this nature. So there's a lot of dividing things, and is the definition of conservative different for today than it was, say, back in the 80s or the 40s or whatever?
Well, yes, Nicholas, the issues are evolving. For example, I am very interested in reform of the criminal justice system, as are a lot of other conservatives. Grover Norquist, Dave Keene, Pat Nolan, Brent Bozell, many of the national conservative leaders. And we're having a big conference in Washington here in a few weeks to urge conservatives to get more involved in reform of the criminal justice system. In fact, the last time I was on C-SPAN last year, Pedro, we were talking about reform of the criminal justice system. That wasn't an issue, quite frankly, back in the 60s and the 70s. And in those days, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, I was one of those that said, lock them up, not to throw the key away, throw the key under the jail, you know. And I have come to realize, as have a lot of other people, that the criminal justice system is broken. It doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for the taxpayers. It's the second largest and fastest growing part of every state budget, second only to Medicaid. And it's certainly not working for prisoners and their families. It's tearing families apart. And too many times we have a high rate of recidivism. People are coming out with a PhD in criminology. Maybe they go in for some low-level offense. They come out with a lot of experience about how to violate the law. It's not working for potential victims because we have too many people prison who, when they come out, are unemployable. Not that they're unemployed, they're unemployable. They don't have skills. And the last thing we need is people in our communities who are unemployable. So the criminal justice system is an issue that conservatives are leading on. Liberals can't lead on this, Pedro, because they're afraid, understandably, because of conservatives having in the past accused them of being soft on crime. In many ways, they still are, quite frankly. So it's up to conservatives, and if conservatives don't lead on this issue, I'm afraid it won't get led. And so a lot of conservatives are stepping forward, and you're seeing it in Texas, in Georgia, in South Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Republican governors and legislators are beginning to step forward and reform the criminal justice system in a very positive way. Fewer people are going into prison. We're building fewer prisons, and crime is going down in these states.
Another look at it is stories in the paper today concerning Senator Rand Paul off of Texas talking about voter ID and taking at least a different approach to voter ID than many in his party.
Right. I had dinner a few weeks ago with Senator Rand Paul, and the first thing he did was to bring up the subject that he had been talking about some of my positions on the radio recently. So, and I've had a number of conversations with Senator Paul about this issue, and it's something he is very seriously interested in.
What do you think about, though, as far as his stance opposed to what generally most would think about, or not most, but a lot in the Conservative Party think about the idea of voter ID and toughening those requirements?
Well, I think conservatives are genuinely and properly concerned about voter ID. I understand Senator Paul's position there, but I think that we have a serious situation with voter ID and voter fraud, and most conservatives would not agree with the senator on that position.
Clarence up next, and Clarence is from Washington State on our independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask your guest there, in overall, is the view of what I perceive as the view of the Tea Party members of the Republican Party, is that they want to allow only one view, and if people oppose them, even within their own party, they go after them and hurt them politically and privately. Now, it looks to me like if he's right and the Tea Party takes over the government through the Republican Party, that what we have to look forward to is the same as like what Darrell Issa showed when Elijah Cummings was making remarks that he didn't want to hear. He turned the microphone off, and I think that's what the rest of us in the nation can look forward to. We'll have the microphones turned off. There will be no voice.
Well, Clarence, you've got it exactly opposite. I'd be curious what you mean by Tea Party want to hurt people privately. I'm not sure what that means.
He's not with us anymore, but go ahead.
But anyway, quite frankly, it's the big government types in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that have basically silenced not just Tea Party, but the vast majority of the conservative voters. When I first got involved in politics, Pedro, back in the 1950s, conservatives didn't have access to the microphones of the country. And through the form of communication that I was fortunate to pioneer, political direct mail, we began as conservatives, as grassroots voters, to be able to go around the blockage that the establishment, the power structure, the ruling class had on the microphones of this country. Then now with cable television and talk radio and the internet, American people have and access to the media to communicate. We have more of a level playing field than we did 40, 50 years ago. So historically, it's been the Democrat Party and the Republican power structure that has tried to silence the grassroots voters. But now with the new and alternative media, the grassroots has a voice that they have never had before.
So as far as 2014 is concerned, what is your involvement and what are you doing as far as messaging? Well,
conservatives are, we're kind of like The well-known book came out 12, 14 years ago called The Starfish and the Spider. The Starfish and the Spider was a wonderful book talking about the power of leaderless organizations. And conservative movement is a leaderless organization, and you have thousands. I live out in Rappahannock County in Virginia, and we have several Tea Party type groups and organizations out there, all independent of the Republican Party, and you're seeing that all over America. So there is no one agenda, except if there is one agenda, it's let's return to the Constitution. Let's remember these wonderful founding documents that our founding fathers gave us, and let's return to the Constitution. I'm afraid that when most politicians think about legislation, the last thing in the world, Pedro, they think about is this constitutional? You know, is this comport with our founding documents here? And I'm afraid it doesn't. And Nancy Pelosi, when asked about the health care legislation, Obamacare, she asked, are you kidding? Is it constitutional? In essence, what does that have to do with anything? So I'm afraid that certainly the Democratic Party and too many Republicans are unhinged from the Constitution.
To your point about leadership, a viewer asked you if the Tea Party needs a leader in one voice. They're getting hammered with no pushback from the establishment.
Oh, well, I hardly think that the Tea Party, it certainly is getting, we're getting hammered, but we're also winning. And I think the Republican Party and some of the Democrats are coming our way. I think because of this new and alternative media, our voice is being heard, and it had not been heard before. And so I'm optimistic for the future. By the way, a lot of conservatives, I talk to a lot of conservatives, travel a lot, Pedro, and hear too often discouragement. They're disillusioned. They were disappointed in the 2012 election. They've been disappointed about how Republicans have governed after the Tea Party and principled conservatives gave them the majority in 2010. But I urge conservatives to be of good cheer and to be optimistic, because I was there in the conservative movement at the beginning, back in the 60s, as executive director of Young Americans for Freedom. And we had a darkness in those days of biblical proportions. After Goldwater's loss in 64, it was really dark. And Nixon's resignation in 74, Jimmy Carter's election in 76. And we didn't have the leadership that we've got out there now. We didn't have the new and alternative media. We didn't have, C-SPAN and the internet. And I'm just so optimistic now that conservatives are just a little bit away, a few years away from taking over the Republican Party. And, we are like a car company that makes great cars, but we've had bad salesmen. Our salesmen have bad-fitting clothes, bad breath, bad-fitting toupee. They've lied to the customers, and maybe on the weekends they're working for the competition. So as long as we have the leadership that we've got now, conservatives are not going to be in a position to govern. And so I say it's like the biblical Jews, conservatives are, who had to wander through the desert for 40 years until that generation of failed, flawed leaders had passed from the scene. Conservatives are not going to get to the political promised land until we get new leaders. People don't like the leadership of John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, Eric Cantor, Kevin McCarthy, Karl Rove, etc. And so if we can replace these leaders in the next few years, the American people will respond positively to the conservative message.
So who are the standout leaders now?
Well, in my opinion, the number one leader of the conservatives today is former Senator Jim DeMint, now head of the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action. Jim DeMint is the de facto leader of the conservative movement. But we have many, many conservative leaders out there. Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Rand Paul and Justin Amash and Tim Huelskamp and many, many others out there. And the 53 years that I've been involved in conservative politics at the national level, Pedro, that's the number one need that yes, we need more organizations, more money, more candidates, more elected officials, more authors, more publications. But all that pales to insignificance to the need for leadership. We haven't had that leadership. And in recent years, we've seen that come along. Hopefully, we will have a lot more leaders that come out of the 2014 and 2016 election. But that's our number one need. And not only do we need need new governors and senators and congressmen, but we need leaders at the local level, the precinct level, the county level. So the listeners who are conservative, believe in constitutional government, there's a role for you to play in as a leader at your local level.
Guest is Richard Viguerie of Conservative HQ and the author of Takeover. Next call is from Dolores, Collierville, Tennessee, Democrats line.
Good morning. I was sitting here listening to him saying about back there he was a leader in the 50s. I'm a 63-year-old black woman. I know how you all did back in the 50s and 60s. If the Tea Party take control of our government any form of way, in the Congress, in the Senate, and even the president, they're taking us backwards. He's sitting up there now. You haven't said anything what you'll do for the poor people, the working people, the unemployed. Everything that you all talking about is hate. Your groups be out at rallies, had guns. Nobody else come up to the rallies and talking with guns, hateful signs against the president. It's never been done before. You're no different than Castro. You all talk about Castro over there. You all doing the same thing that people doing in Syria, Iran, Iraq.
Okay, we'll let our guest respond.
All right. Well, the caller sounds a little unhinged, perhaps. I might remind the caller that the civil rights legislation of the 60s was passed with Republican votes. It was the Democrats that were opposing the civil rights legislation in the 50s and the 60s, and civil rights legislation came about because a majority of the Republicans pushed it forward there. But she talks about doing things for the poor people. I think that it's the conservative policies of empowering the individual and getting the big powerful government off the backs of the American people and release this great engine of American ingenuity that's going to do most for our economy. How's it working for the poor people now under 5.5 years of the Democrat administration? I think our economy is in the tank, and we have a high rate of unemployment, particularly among minorities, the inner cities, and it's because of the policies of big government. And if we want to have bring prosperity back across the board and to all classes of people, we need to release the engine of free enterprise and get government out of our lives. Government is just drowning the American people in rules and regulations.
Mitt Romney, though, this week talking about, his support for raising the minimum wage, a story in the lead story in the Washington Post talking about how Republicans are differing when things coming along the lines of minimum wage. These deal with economics and ultimately what, people's paychecks and things of those matter.
That is a fault line in the Republican Party. It's interesting. It's certainly, politics rears its head here because people are interested in headlines rather than maybe really helping people, because I think every study I've ever read, Pedro, shows that when you increase the minimum wage, you decrease employment. And unemployment, particularly among minorities, goes up. And in many areas, we have 25% and 30% unemployment among minority youth because the entrance-level jobs are so expensive. And it's a fact that when you increase the minimum wage, you will increase unemployment, particularly among disadvantaged youth.
Springfield, Illinois, you are next. This is Dan, Republican line for Richard Viguerie. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, my question is how come the Tea Party won't put term limits in their platform? And if you did have term limits, all these Republican leaders that you'd like to get rid of, we would never hear about by now. I don't think the Tea Party will go anywhere without term limits. Thanks.
Why do you think term limits are important in that matter?
I think term limits would take a lot of the money out of politics. I think term limits would, some of these leaders that's been around forever would be termed out. And honestly, I think that's the only way the Tea Party is going to get the Republicans to believe that, they may be a strength in the Republican Party.
Sorry to cut you off early, but go ahead.
Dan, I share your frustration. I share your anger because it is an outrage that the incumbents, and by the way, we hear this political party, this candidate, that politician talk about we need campaign finance laws. Every campaign finance law in my lifetime has been designed to protect incumbents, and it's had that effect. That's why you have 97, 98% of incumbents getting reelected because of the campaign finance laws. And I think that the elected officials, Republicans and Democrats, have so rigged the rules that it's exceedingly difficult to defeat them. So that if a grassroots voter declares for office on the same day as an incumbent member of the House of Representatives, that incumbent member of the House of Representatives, both have zero in the bank account, he starts with $500,000 to $1 million advantage just in one area, and that's the franking period. He gets $500,000 to $1 million free postage, free mailings. In today's world where everybody has access to thousands of news sources on the internet, talk radio, cable television, the idea that we need to have politicians having, free access to the voters but not their challengers, that's just not fair. It's not American. So I think that we do need term limits. I'm not going to hold my breath till we get it, because it would have to come from the politicians, and they will do everything they can to protect their incumbency.
What about the repeated votes in the House for dismantling of various portions of the Affordable Care Act? Was that a wise strategy?
Oh, absolutely. What I do is marketing. For 50 plus years I've been involved in marketing, primarily the conservative cause, limited government, free markets. And the number one secret, if there is, about marketing, advertising is repetition above everything else, repetition. And so by keeping this issue in front of the American people and reminding them why they're losing their doctor, why they're losing their insurance policy, why they can't go to the hospital they want to go to because of Obamacare, because of the Democrats, I think it's very, very wise politically. And we've seen the unpopularity of Obamacare continue to increase. It has not gone down. It is usually when after a government program is passed, often it's unpopular, but as time goes on, it becomes more popular. The opposite's been true this time. Obamacare, the longer people observe it and see it and experience it, it has been, its unpopularity is growing. So I think it's clearly going to be the number one issue in 2014, 2016, and politically, it's a gift that keeps giving for Republicans.
Do you think, though, for the Republicans, it would cause people to look at them negatively, and ultimately that would affect how people vote in 2014 and 2016?
Well, I don't think allowing people to keep their doctor, their insurance policy, and avoid paying taxes and penalties because they didn't have the insurance policy that Obama and the Democrats want them to have is a negative. I think that's a very positive thing. And the Tea Party movement and Republicans had this giant victory, biggest victory in probably 75, 80 years in 2010, was because of Obamacare. And by the way, Pedro, let me make one quick point here that I outline in my book, Takeover. And it is that a lot of times the Karl Roves of the world, the establishment Republicans, the Chamber of Commerce, says the voters don't like conservative candidates. They don't like Tea Party candidates. They like the establishment. In my lifetime, a long time, Republicans have had four, and only four, really big victories. Reagan's election in 1980, Reagan's re-election in 1984, the Gingrich contract with America in 1994, and the Tea Party victory in 2010. And none of those four big victories was the establishment Republicans front and center. You didn't see Karl Rove, George Bush, Denny Hastert, Bill Frist, Boehner, Eric Cantor, Mitch McConnell in the 2010 election. And the Tea Party gave the Republicans this Congress, and as soon as they gave them the Congress, they abandoned the Tea Party issues and began to grow and expand government. So and that's why the Tea Party is so angry. And the Tea Party is really, the country class voters, 70% of the people are just disappointed. Look what popularity of this town here, Washington, is what, 10, 12, 15%? Mm-hmm.
So as far as those victories before, how do you repeat that then going forward?
Well, you need leaders, okay? And I think we have the leaders now, and we need to make sure that there are issues put forward. The 2008 presidential election, the Republican candidate John McCain, in 2012, Mitt Romney, they were what some of us call content-free elections. There was no issues out there. So if we want big victories, we've got to put forward issues. And by the way, it's been my experience that Republicans, conservatives never win elections unless they're nationalized. Now, we don't always win nationalized elections. 1964 Gold War was a nationalized election when we got our clock cleaned. But whenever they nationalized elections, 1980, 1984, 1988 with George H.W. Bush. 1992, he had moved away from the Reagan principles and became a big governor Republican, and a sitting president got 38% of the vote. So, and the same was true of content-free Bob Dole and John McCain and Mitt Romney. Even George W. Bush, though he won the presidency twice, the first time he won by 537 votes in one state. And the next time, in 2004, he was reelected by one state. Reagan, when he was elected in 1980, won 44 states and reelected with 49 states. So the people respond when you present issues and ideas of how you're going to govern.
Even Senator Lindsey Graham, though, earlier this week talking about issues including Benghazi, he was quoted as saying on Face the Nation, if we're playing politics when Benghazi will get burned. Anyone who believes that this is just about politics, go tell that to family members. Anyone who plays politics when Benghazi will get burned.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. This is not about politics. This is about 4 dead Americans and finding out the truth, and hopefully we can learn from that and not have it repeated in the future. Absolutely. This had nothing to do with politics.
Phil is up next, and Phil's from Centerville, Massachusetts on our independent line. Go ahead.
Well, my question is to you, sir. You said something about it's about 4 dead Americans. I didn't hear any one of y'all say anything about the Iraq War, about how we was misled into and the investigations of that. There's no investigations into what had happened there. Second of all, the Tea Party, you guys are what you call dwindling. If you think that the Tea Party is taking over America by 2017, you are sadly mistaken. You're delusional, sir. There is no way America is going to allow lunatics like Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Mike Lee run this country. It's just not going to happen. So if you could just tell the truth for 1 second, if you believe in America and its Constitution, there should be investigations about Iraq.
I have no problem with looking into Iraq, but I think you'll find that even John Kerry voted for the Iraq War, and Democrats were on board. A high percent of conservatives opposed the Iraq War, and that is a fault line in the Republican Party today between those who want to use the military to run around the world and right wrongs. And most conservatives that come from the Ronald Reagan limited government constitutional conservative wing oppose nation building, as President Bush did when he ran for president in 1999, 2000. He opposed nation building. Then he became the biggest nation building president in American history. I wish, the caller and others would think about what is it really the Tea Party is talking about. They're saying we've got to stop this incredible piling on of debt on our children. We've got establishment Republicans and establishment Democrats going out there and just, spending money for the primary purpose of being reelected that doesn't belong to them. It's our children, our grandchildren's debt. And they're ignoring the Constitution. They're ignoring our founding documents. And they're increasing the size of government, increasing the power of government, decreasing the power of the individual. So the idea that Tea Party is out of step with America, I would propose that it's the establishment, Republican and Democrat, that is out of step and dangerous for America's future.
Julius, good morning from North Carolina, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I just want to ask your guest right here. He don't know a thing about the Constitution. And I just want to know if the Tea Party today is just the same damn Tea Party that was the Klan. Is that just taking off the sheets now since Barack Obama is president?
I would tell your listener he needs to read a little more history, Pedro, because the Klan was a Democrat operation. They weren't Republicans in the Ku Klux Klan. They were Democrats. And it was the Democrats that were the primary opposition to the civil rights legislation of the 50s and the 60s.
What do you think about the perception of the Tea Party versus the reality of it?
It is our PR, if you would, is not good because so many people get their news and information from the mainstream media. Mainstream media is, pretty much on board with bigger government, ever-growing government, higher debt, and higher taxes. And so they're the enemies of the Tea Party, and they're in the business of defining the Tea Party. So we need to do a lot of things as Tea Partiers. And I say Tea Partiers, that's just also including principled, limited government, constitutional conservatives. People like Barry Goldwater, Bill Buckley, that I was back in the 60s. So we've got to do a better job of defining ourselves. One of the law of the jungle is eat or be eaten. The law of politics is define or be defined, okay? And if you're able to define your opponent, you've got a big advantage. And quite frankly, our enemies, our opponents, have done a good job from their perspective of improperly defining the Tea Party. So Tea Party needs to be about the business of connecting with the American people in a way that they haven't. They've connected well with the majority of Republican primary voters, but they need to reach out to the American people and explain who they are, what their beliefs are, and their principles are, because their beliefs are America's beliefs. It's what built this country, and we have allowed our enemies to define us.
You mentioned Goldwater, you mentioned Reagan, icons in conservative thought. Does the decentralized nature of the Tea Party, without one person to stand behind, work against this idea of, defining who you are as far as PR goes?
In many ways, it does, Pedro. There's being as I referenced earlier, a leaderless organization out there. It does work against us. We don't have access to the mainstream microphones like the Karl Roves of the world do. We don't have a headquarters like Reince Priebus does at the Republican National Committee there with big buildings, big staff, and all that. As I said earlier, the de facto leader of the conservative movement is Jim DeMint, and I think we're seeing some really exciting things come out of the Heritage Foundation, Heritage Action, and it's slow coming, but in my book, Takeover, I referenced I've got a plan. In fact, I've got 3 plans in here, one written by me and 2 others by people who responded to a prize that conservativehq.com sponsored. But in the next few years, you'll see this voice. I mean, we didn't have the Mike Lees, the Rand Pauls, the Ted Cruz, the Marco Rubios just a few years ago. So it's slow, but the leadership is coming forward.
John, good morning from Florida. Republican line, you're on with Richard Viguerie. Go ahead.
Yes, I was watching C-SPAN the other day, and Louis Gohmert come out with a chart saying the owners of CBS, NBC, all the news channels, the owners of them have somebody in the White House or in the federal government, and that's why you don't hear the less talk about what's happening in the United States.
Oh, very, very true. It's an incestuous situation between government and too many in the mainstream media. Jay Carney, the president's spokesperson, his wife is an executive at a major mainstream media outlet. And so the government is, in bed, so to speak, with, the mainstream media. And conservatives, as I am, the Bill Buckleys, the Ronald Reagans of the world, only were able to be successful in advancing our cause because of the rise of the new and alternative media. As I said earlier, when I got involved in politics, Pedro, back in the 50s or 60s, we were like the tree that fell in the forest. Nobody heard about our causes, our candidates, our organizations, but through the rise of what I was fortunate to pioneer, political direct mail, then followed by talk radio, cable television, C-SPAN, the internet. Now we have much more of a level playing field, and our voices are being heard. But there'd be no conservative movement worthy of the name if it weren't for the new and alternative media, because the mainstream media, the New York Times of the world, the Washington Post, the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, they have historically shut us out, and they would continue to do so. So the new and alternative media has given the American people at the grassroots level a voice that they've never had in the history of the world.
How would you rate conservatives' use or mastery of social media and the internet, and especially for political purposes?
Not good, Pedro. When I started in the 1960s, pioneering political direct mail, I caught a lot of criticism, quite frankly, regularly attacked on ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, Time Magazine, etc., you know, and because nobody was doing political direct mail. But all that criticism stopped within a few hours. And those few hours was election night, November 1980, when you could hear the political community, the media say, aha, that's what Viguerie and friends have been up to. So the left ran out there real quick, like after Reagan's election in 1980, to duplicate what the conservatives had been doing in direct mail. But I told my conservative friends, don't worry, because it's taken me 15 years to do this, and I'm smarter than they are, so it'll take them probably 20, 25 years. Not so. Within 3 or 4 years, the left had caught up with the conservatives, and to this day, I think the liberals do a significantly better job of marketing using the new and alternative media, including the social media, than do the Republicans and the conservatives.
Here's Brenda on our independent line, and she's joining us from Miami, Florida. Good morning. Go ahead.
Good morning. I want to go back to the question about who exactly are the Tea Party leaders. And from my understanding is that they came out from this midterm election of 2000, which the previous caller alluded to, about them really coming out from President Obama being elected. And I want to tie that into what the author said earlier about President Reagan in his leadership capacity, how he actually had followers. And these people who came in during this midterm 2010 election, they have to learn how to be followers first instead of coming in and acting like it's their way or the highway.
Few comments on that, Pedro. The Tea Party came into being in February of 2009, almost simultaneously with Barack Obama becoming president. All my political life, 50-plus years, people periodically ask me, Richard, is it too late to turn things around, or have we gone down the road to socialism too far to ever turn back to constitutional government? And I've always had one answer and one answer only, and that is the only chance I see to save America is if things get real bad real quick. Well, guess what? With the arrival of Obama and the supermajorities in the Congress in 2009, 2010, that water turned high. It was boiling. The American people were jumping out of it. And so the Tea Party came out of the excesses of the Democrats. And by the way, the Tea Party came about primarily, maybe above everything else, because of the failure of the Republican Party. If the Republicans had been effective opponents to the Democrats, you wouldn't have a need for a Tea Party. But the Tea Party came into existence because there was no leader out there. And by the way, the caller talked about how Tea Party is preventing things from getting done. And we hear about gridlock. Norm Ornstein wrote a book about It's Worse Than You Think, how the Republicans are preventing from happening, that's from happening. That's code for saying that the Republicans are not allowing the Democrats to grow government. Compromise in this town, Pedro, means let's grow government at some level. Maybe we don't get everything that the Democrats want, but compromise means moving up the reach and expansion of government. Compromise never means to Democrats, to the media, reduced government, more freedom for the individual. So there is gridlock now because American people's voice is being heard, and we don't want government to continue to grow, and we don't want to continue to lose our liberties.
What's the likelihood that in 2016 you're going to see a Republican presidential candidate that reflects your principles?
I think it's guaranteed. We've had good candidates run for president in the last 15, 20 years, but we haven't had very many top-tier, principled, limited government constitutional conservatives run. In 2016, we're going to have a traffic jam of good, limited government, constitutional conservatives. Maybe a Ted Cruz might run. Maybe a Rand Paul. Maybe a governor, Mike Pence, Governor Scott Walker, Governor Rick Scott in Florida, Bobby Jindal, Perry in Texas. I think that there's going to be, a half a dozen or more, which on the one hand is a positive, a strength, but it's also a cause for concern for conservatives, because the conservative vote could be split so many different ways, as it was in 2008, 2012 in the primaries, that it would allow the big government candidate, as it was with McCain and Romney, to end up with the nomination. So we have to be concerned about that. Hopefully conservatives will come together in 2015, unite behind one principled conservative, and throw our support there. And then when it's one-on-one, one big Republican versus one limited government conservative, conservatives will prevail, probably 70-30.
Richard Viguerie, the head of Conservative HQ and the author of Takeover, the 100-year war for the soul of the GOP and how conservatives can finally win it. Mr. Viguerie, thank you.
Always a pleasure, Pedro.